Imagine you're standing in the middle of Munich during a crisp September morning. Around you, the air is filled with the scent of roasted nuts from street vendors and the distant low hum of the electric shuttles. You're here for the IAA Mobility Show, the world's most prestigious stage for automotive excellence. For decades, this event was a victory lap for German engineering. It was where the kings of the road, Volkswagen, BMW, and Mercedes-Benz, showed the world exactly why they were untouchable. But as you walk through the glass-domed halls, something feels off. There's a strange, hollow quiet behind the marketing glitter. You notice that the largest, most vibrant displays aren't coming from Stuttgart or Wolfsburg anymore. Instead, they belong to brands you might have barely heard of 5 years ago. Here is the shocking reality. For the first time in its 87-year history, Volkswagen, the very soul of German industry, is seriously considering closing factories on its own home soil. You probably grew up thinking that the German car industry was an unbreakable fortress, a machine that would simply out-engineer any problem. But that fortress is showing deep, jagged cracks. The question isn't just about whether the cars are good enough anymore. It's about whether the nation that invented the automobile is actually losing the race to keep it alive. Look closer at the 2024 production numbers and the picture gets even darker. Germany's industrial heartbeat didn't just skip a beat, it hit a 20-year low. By the time the final tallies for 2024 were being calculated in early 2025, the industry was staring at a production level nearly 13% lower than what it was before the pandemic. To put that in perspective, that's millions of cars that simply aren't being built, thousands of shifts that aren't being worked. It's enough lost metal and glass to pave a highway across the continent. The mood at the Munich show wasn't one of celebration, but of a quiet, desperate scramble. You watch as German executives in tailored suits linger around Chinese-made SUVs, peering into the wheel wells and tapping on the touchscreen consoles with a mix of curiosity and genuine fear. They are realizing that while they were perfecting the sound of a closing car door, the rest of the world was rebuilding the entire concept of a car from the ground up. Then it hits you. The energy price shock wasn't just a headline from the news, it's a physical weight sitting on every assembly line in the country. Take the case of Gerhardi Plastics Technology. This isn't a household name, but if you've ever admired the shiny, chrome-plated badge on a Mercedes-Benz, you've seen their work. They had been around for over 200 years. Think about that for a second. This company survived world wars, the Great Depression, and the transition from horse-drawn carriages to supercars. Yet, in late 2024, they filed for bankruptcy. The cost of the electricity needed to run their chrome plating vats simply became higher than the value of the parts they were making. When the people who make the badges can't afford to keep the lights on, you know the engine of the economy is stalling. The supply chain is bleeding out in silence, one small town supplier at a time. This isn't just about the big logos, it's about the Mittelstand, the medium-sized companies that form the backbone of German wealth. You trace the map of these industrial towns and see a domino effect. If the big factory in Wolfsburg cuts a shift, the plastic molder 3 towns over loses its only client. By the middle of 2024, corporate bankruptcies in Germany had jumped by over 22%. It's a slow-motion collapse that feels more like an erosion than a sudden explosion. Meanwhile, inside the boardroom at Volkswagen, the tension is thick enough to choke on. For decades, there was an unwritten rule: you do not close a German plant. It was the ultimate taboo, but in late 2024, that rule was shredded. The executives presented a plan that included closing the iconic, transparent factory in Dresden by 2025. Imagine a building made almost entirely of glass, where you could watch electric cars being assembled, like high-end watches. It was supposed to be the future. Now, it's a symbol of a dream that ran out of cash. The disagreement between management and the powerful labor unions turned into a full-scale industrial war. You hear the echoes of 35,000 jobs being negotiated away like pieces on a chessboard. The unions argue that the workers are being punished for the mistakes of managers who spent billions on diesel technology while the world was moving to batteries. Management counters that they simply cannot compete when a German auto worker costs 62 euros an hour, while their rivals in Spain or China are paying a fraction of that. There's a real disagreement on whether this is a temporary dip or the beginning of the end. Some analysts argue that Germany is just going through a painful restructuring and will emerge leaner and tech-focused. Others aren't so sure. They look at the energy prices, which are 3 to 5 times higher than in the US or China, and wonder how any factory can survive that long term. You notice the shift in the language used by the Federal Motor Vehicle Office. The reports are no longer about growth targets, but about managing the decline. When you look at the streets of Wolfsburg or Stuttgart, the anxiety is visible. People who have worked for the company for 3 generations are suddenly checking their pension plans. You listen to the talk in the local pubs, and it's not about the next car model. It's about whether the local plant will still be there in 2027. It feels like watching a giant try to run a marathon with a heavy backpack while everyone else is on electric scooters. The reality check comes when you realize that Germany isn't just losing its lead, it's losing its identity. For 100 years, being German meant being the best at making things that move. It was a culture built on the precision of pistons and the smell of oil. But pistons don't matter in a world of software and lithium. In late 2024, the IFO Institute's Business Climate Index for the auto industry plummeted into deep negative territory. It wasn't just a bad quarter. It was a collective realization that the old ways of doing things were officially over. You watch the news segments from late 2024 and early 2025, and the tone has shifted from concern to alarm. There are reports of empty production lines and thousands of unsold electric vehicles sitting in port lots because they're too expensive for the average consumer. The government had abruptly cut subsidies for EVs at the end of 2023, and the market hasn't recovered since. It's a perfect storm: high costs, low demand, and a relentless tide of cheaper, smarter competition from the east. Now look closer at the factory gates. The protests in late 2024 weren't just about money. They were about fear. Workers held signs that read, "Our future is not for sale." But the market doesn't care about sentiment. The market cares about margins. And with German manufacturers seeing their profits drop by 27%, while Japanese and American rivals were staying steady, or even growing, the math just doesn't add up. So what happens next? Does the nation pivot, or does it hold on to the past until the last light goes out in Dresden? The 2024 Munich show was the moment the world saw the king was naked. The question for 2025 and 2026 is whether he can find some new clothes before he freezes. As the first section of this story closes, the engines are indeed stalling, and the silence is the loudest thing in the room. The rear-view mirror of a Mercedes-Benz used to be a very lonely place. For decades, the only things German engineers saw back there were rivals who were perpetually 2 steps behind. But if you look at those mirrors today, the image is dominated by a single, terrifying shape: the Chinese dragon. This isn't the same China that used to build cheap plastic toys and low-quality knockoffs. This is a high-tech superpower that has spent the last decade quietly cornering every single part of the electric vehicle world. While Germany was perfecting the fuel injectors for diesel engines, China was buying up lithium mines and building battery gigafactories. The shift has been so fast that it feels like the global automotive crown wasn't just stolen. It was simply picked up off the floor while the Germans were looking the other way. Now look closer at the horizon of the North Sea. Picture the port of Bremerhaven in early 2025. This place is one of the largest car shipping hubs on the planet. Usually it's a sea of German-made luxury sedans waiting to be sent to eager buyers in Asia and America. But throughout 2024 and 2025, the flow started to reverse in a way that left industry veterans speechless. Massive car carriers, some as long as 3 football fields, began docking with a frequency that felt like an invasion. One ship in particular, the BYD Explorer number 1, became a symbol of this new era. It is a specialized vessel designed to carry 7,000 vehicles in one go. As the ramp lowered, a relentless stream of sleek, futuristic EVs rolled onto German soil. These weren't just cars. They were rolling declarations of war. Here's the thing about these new arrivals. They are beating the Germans at their own game of quality, but they're doing it with software instead of steel. You might remember when made in China meant something was likely to break. That world is dead. Today, a young professional in Berlin or Munich can sit inside a Chinese-made BYD or a Xiaomi SU7 and see a cabin that makes a 2025 Audi look like a relic from the 90s. The screens are faster, the voice commands actually work, and the integration with their digital life is seamless. It's a software wall that German engineering is struggling to climb. For 100 years, the value of a car was in its engine. Now the value is in the code. Finance people still go back and forth on whether China's lead in battery technology is truly permanent or just a very long head start. Some argue that the massive state subsidies provided by Beijing have created an artificial advantage that will eventually crumble. Others point to the raw efficiency of the Chinese supply chain and argue that Germany has simply lost its competitive edge for good. In mid-2024, the European Commission officially weighed in, announcing provisional tariffs of up to 38% on Chinese electric vehicles. They called it a move to level the playing field against unfair subsidies. But the reaction from the German car companies wasn't what you'd expect. Instead of cheering for protection, the bosses at BMW and Mercedes were terrified. They were terrified because they knew that any blow to China would lead to a counterpunch that could knock them out. By late 2024, China accounted for roughly 30% to 40% of the total profits for the big three German automakers. It was their most important market, their golden goose. When China threatened to retaliate with its own tariffs on large-engine luxury cars, the boards of directors in Munich and Stuttgart went into a state of panic. You see the logos of these companies and think of power, but behind closed doors they were pleading with politicians to back down. They were caught in a geopolitical pincer move. They couldn't compete with Chinese tech at home, and they couldn't afford to lose their Chinese customers abroad. Meanwhile, a quiet but intense drama was playing out in the research and development centers across Bavaria. Imagine a frantic board meeting at BMW's headquarters, the iconic four-cylinder building. The air is thick with the scent of expensive coffee and the palpable stress of 300 engineers. They are looking at the specs for their Neue Klasse electric platform, which is supposed to be their big comeback in late 2025. But every time they think they've matched a Chinese competitor's range or charging speed, a new model from Shenzhen or Shanghai hits the market with better stats and a price tag that is 20,000 euros lower. One executive reportedly told his team that they weren't just fighting a car company. They were fighting a software company that happened to have a factory. The cultural clash is just as brutal as the technical one. In the Chinese tech hubs, there is a 996 work culture, 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week. In Germany, the powerful IG Metall union has spent decades fighting for, and winning, a 35-hour work week and extensive vacation time. This isn't a knock on the German lifestyle, it's a high standard of living that everyone should want. But when it comes to the sheer speed of innovation, the math is unforgiving. A Chinese car company can go from a blank sheet of paper to a production-ready EV in less than 2 years. For a German company, that same process usually takes 5. In the fast-moving world of batteries and AI, that 3-year gap is an eternity. Then it hits. Reports began to surface in late 2024 about German car dealers having to offer massive, record-breaking discounts just to move their electric inventory. The Mercedes EQS, once touted as the S-Class of the electric era, was sitting on lots for months. People who wanted luxury were sticking with the classic gas-powered engines, and people who wanted electric were looking at Tesla or the new Chinese brands. The prestige of the Silver Star or the blue and white roundel was no longer enough to justify a 6-figure price tag when the technology felt second best. You watch the news clips of the 2025 Shanghai Auto Show, and the body language tells the whole story. German executives are no longer the stars of the show, they are the tourists. They are seen walking around with tablets, taking photos of the battery layouts and sensor placements on Chinese cars. It's a total reversal of the last 50 years. One high-ranking official from a German parts supplier admitted in an interview that they were stunned by the integration of AI in the latest Chinese models. It wasn't just a gimmick. It was a fundamental shift in how people interact with their vehicles. The Dragon isn't just in the rear view anymore. It's pulling into the lane beside them and accelerating. As 2025 rolled into 2026, the data from the China Passenger Car Association confirmed the nightmare. Local brands had taken over 50% of the domestic market for the first time ever, pushing the German brands into a shrinking corner. Back in Europe, the port of Bremerhaven continued to fill up with ships from the east. The Made in Germany label, which once stood as a guarantee of being the best in the world, was suddenly facing a world that had moved on to a different set of values. It's a realization that is sinking in across the country. The race isn't about how well you build a piston, but how well you build a computer that can drive. Imagine you're walking through a small, fog-heavy town in the Swabian Alps of southern Germany. This is the heart of the Mittelstand, the dense network of family-owned companies that have powered the German economy for generations. In towns like these, the local economy doesn't revolve around a bank or a tech startup. it revolves around a single factory that makes something incredibly specific, like fuel injection nozzles or high-precision gearbox cogs. For 100 years, this was the safest bet in the world. If you were an engineer here, you had a job for life, a solid house, and a respected place in the community. But as you look at the factory gates today, there is a sense of quiet dread hanging over the assembly lines. The structural trap Germany finds itself in is built entirely of pistons and valves. You see, an internal combustion engine is a mechanical masterpiece with over 2,000 moving parts. Each of those parts represents a business, a patent, and a specialized workforce. An electric motor, by comparison, has about 20. It's a brutal, mathematical reduction of complexity. In early 2025, reports began to circulate that up to 30% of these small to medium suppliers were facing a liquidity crisis. They weren't just losing orders. Their entire reason for existing was being phased out by government decree and market shifts. Here's the thing about the Mittelstand. They are the world's best at doing one thing perfectly, but that perfection has become a cage. You watch as a third-generation owner of a machine shop stares at his multi-million euro lathes, realizing they can't be repurposed to make battery cells or semiconductors. These companies don't have the massive cash reserves of a global giant like Volkswagen. They rely on steady, predictable cycles. When the 2025 demand for gas-powered cars softened faster than anyone predicted, the floor simply dropped out. By the middle of that year, the headlines in German regional papers were a drumbeat of insolvency, restructuring, and temporary closures. Now look closer at the city of Wolfsburg in late 2025. This isn't just a city with a car factory, it is a city that is a car factory. When VW sneezes, Wolfsburg catches pneumonia. You notice the atmosphere in the city center has turned somber. The local shops and restaurants, which once thrived on the generous bonuses of auto workers, are seeing their tables go empty. The 2025 labor protests that shook the region weren't just about wages. They were a visceral reaction to the realization that the social contract, the idea that hard work in the car industry guaranteed a middle-class life, was being torn up. Thousands of workers gathered outside the main plant, their whistles and chants echoing off the brick walls, demanding answers that the executives in the high-rise offices simply didn't have. Analysts still argue about whether the German government did enough to help these smaller players transition. Some say the green transformation was pushed too hard and too fast, leaving the backbone of the country behind. Others argue that the industry was too arrogant, ignoring the rise of Tesla and BYD for a decade because they were too busy making real cars. Either way, the consequence is a hollowed-out supply chain. When a specialized piston maker goes bankrupt in a small town, that town doesn't just lose jobs, it loses its identity. You see people who have spent 30 years mastering the art of the engine suddenly being told their skills are as relevant as a blacksmith's in the age of the Ford Model T. The drama reached a boiling point during the Automotive Summit in Berlin in late 2025. Picture a room full of politicians, union leaders, and billionaire CEOs, all sitting around a massive mahogany table. The tension was palpable. The politicians wanted the companies to commit to climate neutrality and domestic jobs, while the CEOs pointed to their shrinking margins and the energy price trap. Germany had gone from having some of the most stable energy in Europe to being one of the most expensive places on earth to run a factory. One CEO reportedly stood up and asked the room, "How can I build a competitive battery in a country where electricity costs 4 times more than in Texas?" Meanwhile, the Made in Germany label was suffering a quiet, painful demotion. It used to be a mark of prestige that allowed companies to charge a premium. But in a world of electric vehicles, the prestige has shifted toward the battery range and the infotainment system. You trace the shift in consumer sentiment through 2025, and it's clear. Younger buyers in Berlin or Hamburg care more about how their phone syncs with the dashboard than how many cylinders are under the hood. The very thing that made Germany great, its mastery of mechanical engineering, has become a liability in a digital-first world. Then it hits the stock market. In the fall of 2025, the share prices of major German suppliers like Continental and ZF Friedrichshafen took a significant hit. Investors weren't just worried about the next quarter, they were pricing in the end of an era. Some analysts at the time argued that the piston era was officially over, and the market was now looking for software-defined vehicles. For the German giants, this was like being told they had to win a swimming race while wearing a suit of armor. They had the talent and the money, but they were weighed down by a legacy of physical assets that were rapidly losing value. You listen to the earnings calls from late 2025, and the tone is defensive. Executives are talking about efficiency programs and synergy effects, which is corporate speak for cutting jobs and closing departments. The Mittelstand suppliers who don't have the luxury of global diversification are the ones bearing the brunt of it. You see filings from companies that have been in the same family since the 1890s, now looking for Chinese or American investors just to keep the lights on for another 6 months. It's a fire sale of German industrial heritage. So what happens when a nation built on pistons loses its purpose? The outcome isn't a sudden collapse, but a grinding, painful friction. The 2025 protests were a warning shot. The realization that the past is gone and the future is expensive has created a deep rift in German society. As you watch the sun set over the factory chimneys in the Swabian Alps, you realize that the machines are still humming for now, but the rhythm has changed. It's no longer the confident pulse of a world leader, it's the frantic, irregular heartbeat of an industry trying to figure out how to survive in a world that no longer needs its greatest invention. The halls of the Bundestag in Berlin often feel like a cathedral dedicated to the status quo, but by the start of 2026, the atmosphere had shifted into something far more frantic. You can almost see the gears of government grinding against each other as politicians try to fix a machine that they accidentally helped break. For years, the green transformation was sold as a win-win. Germany would lead the world in clean tech, and the blue-collar workers in the car plants would simply trade their wrenches for tablets. But as 2026 began, that promise felt less like a plan and more like a fairy tale. The transition didn't just cost money, it cost the certainty that had defined German life since the end of the Second World War. Here's the thing about the political paralysis in Berlin. It's born out of a desperate attempt to please everyone while the budget is shrinking. You watch the debates over the 2026 Competitiveness Fund, a massive pot of money meant to jumpstart the stalling economy. In early January 2026, the government finally admitted that the sudden cut to electric vehicle subsidies back in 2023 had been a disaster. It had caused sales to fall off a cliff, leaving domestic manufacturers with thousands of cars sitting in parking lots gathering dust. So, in a move that some critics called too little, too late, Berlin announced a fresh round of subsidies specifically targeted at middle-class families. It was a 2026 subsidy war, not just against high prices, but against the public's growing skepticism. Now look closer at the tension between Berlin and Brussels. While the German government was trying to find billions of euros to save its car makers, the European Commission was pushing for even stricter rules on how that money could be spent. You see the friction in the headlines about state aid rules. Brussels wants a level playing field across the entire European Union, but Germany, the EU's biggest economy, wants the freedom to protect its own crown jewels. It's a classic standoff. The German government is trying to subsidize its way out of a crisis, while their neighbors in France and Italy are watching with a mix of jealousy and concern. Economists still debate whether these massive government bailouts actually help or if they just prolong the agony of a dying business model. Some argue that without the 2026 automotive package, the entire German industrial sector would have collapsed under the weight of high energy costs. Others point to the fact that these subsidies often go to the largest companies, while the smaller suppliers, the ones we talked about earlier, are left to fend for themselves. You see the frustration in the eyes of a small-town mayor whose local economy depends on a parts factory. For him, the green transformation hasn't brought a new battery plant. It's only brought higher electricity bills and a sense that Berlin has forgotten about people like him. Meanwhile, just outside of Berlin, a very different story was unfolding in the town of Grünheide. This is the home of Tesla's Giga Berlin, and by 2026, it had become a persistent thorn in the side of the German automotive establishment. While the traditional giants like Volkswagen and Mercedes were announcing shift cuts and plant closures, Tesla was actually ramping up. You notice the contrast in the production reports from early 2026. Tesla's plant manager, André Thierig, confirmed that they had managed to avoid layoffs and were consistently hitting their quarterly growth targets. They were even shipping German-made Model Ys all the way to Canada to avoid North American tariffs. The success of the Grünheide plant is a psychological blow to the German industry. It proves that you can build cars in Germany and be profitable, if you do it differently. You watch as local workers at the nearby traditional plants look at the Tesla facility with a mix of resentment and envy. Tesla doesn't have the decades of union-negotiated perks, but it also doesn't have the baggage of a 100-year-old corporate hierarchy. It's leaner, faster, and more aggressive. When Tesla announced it was moving forward with its 2026 expansion plans, it felt like a silent rebuke to every German CEO who had blamed high labor costs for their own failures. The drama hit a fever pitch in mid-2026 during the internal collapse of the 2035 combustion engine ban negotiations. This was supposed to be the definitive end date, the moment the piston died forever. But the reality of 2026 forced a humiliating retreat. You see the shift in the European Commission's language as they move to water down the ban from a 100% reduction in emissions to 90%. That 10% might sound small, but it's a massive victory for the combustion engine. It effectively means that highly efficient gas-powered cars and plug-in hybrids can stay on the road indefinitely, provided they use specialized e-fuels. This policy pivot was a direct result of the political pressure coming from Berlin. The German government, facing a blue-collar revolt and the very real threat of an industrial extinction, had to walk back its green ambitions to save its voters' jobs. It was a confusing signal, as some environmental groups put it, but for the workers in Stuttgart and Munich, it was a lifeline. You listen to the talk on the factory floors, and for the first time in years, there's a flicker of hope. But it's a fragile hope. The industry is now forced to invest in two different worlds at once: the expensive future of electric and the lingering past of gas. So what happens next? The subsidy wars of 2026 were a desperate attempt to buy time. But time is exactly what Germany is running out of. You watch the filings from the Ministry of Economic Affairs and see that even with the new money, the growth forecasts for 2026 were being downgraded. The fiscal stimulus was taking hold slower than expected, and the structural reforms were bogged down in a mire of bureaucracy. It's a state of political paralysis that feels like trying to drive a car with one foot on the gas and the other on the brake. As you look at the landscape of 2026, you notice that the green transformation has become a dirty word in many industrial towns. The blue-collar worker, once the hero of the German story, now feels like a pawn in a game they don't understand. They see the politicians in Berlin making grand speeches about modernization, while their own local plant is cutting its third shift. The outcome of this period isn't a clean transition. It's a messy, expensive compromise that satisfies no one and keeps the entire industry in a state of nervous suspense. The engine hasn't quite died, but it's coughing, and the people behind the wheel aren't sure which way to turn. Imagine you're looking at a high-tech map of the global automotive world in early 2026. For almost a century, that map had one massive, glowing center of gravity located right in the heart of Europe. Everything else, the factories in Detroit, the assembly lines in Tokyo, the emerging hubs in Seoul, seem to revolve around the standards set by German engineers. But as you watch the data points flicker and shift today, that center is dimming. New lights are flashing with blinding intensity in places like Shenzhen, Shanghai, and Austin. The map is being redrawn in real time, and for the first time since the invention of the car, Germany is no longer the one holding the pen. The reality of this new world arrived with a cold, clinical thud in late January 2026. You notice the headlines on the morning of January 28th. WKW, Automotive, a major supplier that provided the iconic trim and decorative slats for Mercedes and BMW, officially declared bankruptcy. This wasn't just a small-scale failure. It was a company with nearly 4,000 employees and a history that spanned generations. When the people who make the very things that give a luxury car its premium feel can no longer stay afloat, you realize the industry isn't just changing, it's undergoing a structural amputation. The 2026 bankruptcy of WKW was a final, undeniable proof that the old supply chain, built on the prestige of physical parts, was collapsing under the weight of the new electric reality. You hear the echoes of this shift in the 2026 earnings calls, which have taken on a tone that some analysts are calling brutally sober. Gone are the days of promising infinite growth in the Chinese market. Instead, the executives at BMW and Mercedes-Benz are delivering numbers that look like a retreat. In early 2026, reports surfaced that both companies had provided their suppliers with a shocking forecast. They expect their sales in China to fall below 500,000 units. To put that in perspective, that's a rollback to levels they haven't seen since 2016. A decade of growth, investment, and market dominance has been erased in less than 24 months. The new map of power shows that the German giants are no longer trying to be the kings of the mass market. They are retreating to the high ground of ultra-luxury, hoping that the world's wealthiest 1% will still pay a premium for a German badge, even if the technology underneath is being matched by rivals. You see the strategy in the decision to kill off smaller, more affordable models to focus on six-figure sedans. It's a value over volume play, but it comes with a high price. Without the massive volume of the mass market, the economies of scale that made German cars affordable to the middle class are disappearing. Every car becomes more expensive to build, which makes them even harder to sell. It's a circular trap that is tightening every quarter. Meanwhile, the human map of Germany is changing just as fast. You watch as a new generation of engineers in Stuttgart and Munich makes a decision that would have been unthinkable 5 years ago. Instead of fighting for a spot at a traditional car company, they are looking for work in software firms, AI startups, or even defense contractors. The prestige of being an automotive engineer is being replaced by the lure of being a software architect. In late 2025 and early 2026, the job market for traditional mechanical roles in the auto sector stagnated, while the demand for AI specialists in Germany jumped by over 35%. The brain drain is real, and it's moving away from the piston and toward the chip. Finance people still go back and forth on whether Germany can successfully reinvent itself as a high-tech hub for software-defined vehicles. Some argue that the country's deep engineering roots and the new AI made in Germany government strategy will eventually pay off, turning the old factory towns into Silicon Valleys of the Rhine. Others are far more skeptical. They point to the fact that while Germany is busy restructuring, the Chinese and American tech giants are already on their third or fourth generation of AI driving systems. There's a real disagreement on whether you can simply pivot a 100-year-old industrial culture fast enough to survive a digital revolution. You trace the physical symbols of this decline to the city of Dresden. In late December 2025, the transparent factory, the glass-walled cathedral of German engineering we talked about earlier, officially stopped producing cars. By January 2026, the building was being prepared for a new life as a research campus for the Technical University of Dresden, focusing on microchips and robotics. It is a bittersweet wind-down for one of the world's most famous garages. It's no longer a place where you go to watch a car being born. It's a place where you go to study the technology that replaced it. It's a transition that feels necessary, but it lacks the visceral, oily soul of the industry that built modern Germany. The outcome of the 2026 Automotive Extinction isn't the death of the German car, but the death of the German car as we knew it. The industry that remains will be smaller, leaner, and far more dependent on global partnerships. You see the big three brands, VW, BMW, and Mercedes, increasingly outsourcing their intelligence to Chinese software firms and American cloud providers. They are becoming the high-end hardware for someone else's software. It's a functional survival, but the era of German dominance is over. The nation that invented the car has been forced to accept a role as a specialized player in a game where they no longer make the rules. As you look at the factory lights in Wolfsburg one last time, you realize that the 2026 crisis wasn't just a bad business cycle. It was a moment of deep national reckoning. Germany spent a century perfecting a machine that the world eventually decided it didn't want anymore. The transition to whatever comes next will be long, expensive, and deeply personal for the millions of people whose lives are still tied to the sound of an engine. The map has changed, the crown has moved, and the road ahead is one that Germany will have to navigate without the comfort of being in the lead. The story of the German auto industry is a powerful reminder of how quickly the world can move, even for a giant that seems untouchable. It's a shift that affects not just the people in the factories, but anyone who cares about the global economy and the future of how we get around. I'd love to hear your perspective on this. Where are you watching this from today? And what's the economic vibe like in your part of the world right now? Are you seeing similar shifts in your local industries? Or perhaps you have your own plans for navigating these changing times? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. It's always fascinating to see how these global trends ripple out into our everyday lives, and your stories help paint the full picture. If you found this deep dive into the 2026 automotive landscape helpful, please take a second to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us keep bringing you these stories of finance and economics, and it ensures you won't miss our next look into the forces shaping our world. Thank you for spending this time with me today. Whether the future is electric, autonomous, or something we haven't even dreamed of yet, we'll be here to track the journey together. Stay curious, stay informed, and I'll see you in the next one.